All right, students. Chapter 4 covers colonial America, which the most important colonies during that time were Jamestown and Plymouth, but there was one before that called Roanoke. Spain had been very successful in North America, and for 100 years before there was any English activity in North America, Spain had been going back and forth and very successful in the area. And England wanted a piece of that. The first attempt of that was led by John White in 1587, and that was Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. And this was led by Sir Walter Raleigh. He called this place Virginia after his queen. Well, the settlers were left there because they ran out of supplies, and Raleigh took his ship back to England to get the supplies they needed. But at the time, England was at a war with Spain, and so the queen wouldn't let him take his ship right back. She said, "We need your ship for the war," and so he ended up serving her in that capacity for a while. And it was 3 years later when he got back there with his ship, and by that point, the settlers were all gone, and there was no trace of them, literally no trace. And the only word left, the only clue that was left there was some words carved into a fence post, Croatoan. Now, this was a pretty good clue, actually. What had happened was there were some Croatoan Indians that had lived there. And most scholars and historians think that the settlers went and lived with those Indians. In fact, later, there was some genetic work done on the Native American tribes that live in that area. And they have found strains of Northern European DNA. So they're figuring pretty strongly now that that's exactly what happened, that they went and lived with the Native Americans. Of course, lots and lots of theories had cropped up. Did the Spanish come and attack them? Because certainly the Spanish, if they found out the British were there, they wouldn't want them there. And the Spanish had colonies in Florida. And so if they were, sailing up the coast and saw the British there, they wouldn't have liked that. Or did the Native Americans come and attack them and kill all of them? So for a long time, no one was quite sure what happened, but most people supposed that they went away and lived peaceably among the Native Americans, which is what most historians now believe happened. Okay, that aside, the very first important colony that you need to know about is Jamestown. A new ruler came to the throne, King James, and he decides to try again. And you need to know that King James, or the Jamestown colony, was formed by businessmen. It was formed by a joint stock company. And a joint stock company is formed to make money. It's where we get the idea of a stock market. You buy shares in something, you put money in order to get money back out. This joint stock company was called the Virginia Company. And so you need to remember, this is important, Jamestown was founded for economic reasons, to make money. That was the sole purpose of it being founded. It was founded in 1607. The first 144 settlers called it Jamestown in honor of their king. And they were hoping to find gold. They had heard stories of the Spanish finding gold in places, although the Spanish had exaggerated some of those stories. And so that's what they were looking for too. They were looking for gold. And unfortunately, they did not bring the things with them that they needed to be successful in a harsh environment. They brought with them tests for gold and things to dig for gold, but they didn't bring seeds or animals or plows or things to harvest crops with. And so you will see that that sort of caused them a problem later on. So what they faced was disease, lack of supplies, and hostile Native Americans in a harsh environment. If someone ever asks you what are the reasons that a colony failed, you can almost always point to these three things: disease, lack of supplies, a harsh environment, and sometimes attacks by local natives. Not always, though, but sometimes. So, if you say, 1,000 years from now, why did the first colony on Mars fail? Well, lack of supplies, disease, and a harsh environment. Those three things, when you go to college, if some professor asks you, you can probably answer that, and you will be pretty safe to say those were the three things that caused the colony to fail, whatever the colony was. Okay. A man named John Smith came to Jamestown and took over because he said, "You're not going to be successful. You're just, it's a classic epic fail what you're doing here." And And he said, you are going to have to work if you want food. Up until that point, most of these guys were like wealthy gentlemen's brothers over in England. If you were the oldest son, you inherited all the land and all the money. And so sometimes the second oldest son said, hey, I'm going to go to America and find gold, and that's how I'm going to make my fortune. Well, they didn't really want to dig around in the dirt and plant crops and harvest crops. They were too good for that. But John Smith came aboard and said, oh, I think you will. I think you will plant crops, and I think you will harvest crops if you want to eat. He also built up a good relationship with a local Native American tribe and was able to trade with them for food. So, he's like, okay, we have things you might want, and so if you will help us with our food problem here, we'll trade with you. Unfortunately, not very long after that, he was injured and had to return to England. And when he left, the Native Americans said, well, the rest of you aren't Smith, and we don't trust you. And they stopped helping the colonists, and the colonists began to starve again. There was an especially poor growing season to boot, and the winter of 1609 and 1610 is known as the starving time. You probably need to know that this thing is so bad that it's known as the starving time. By the time of 1609 happened, there were up to 214 colonists present from the original 144. So by the fall of 1609, there were 214 colonists present. By the spring of 1610, only 60 were left. That's 28% of the people were left from the total. There were reports of cannibalism that they had resorted to during the winter. A couple things happened during this time. First, they didn't have the crops that they needed because they had failed to prepare for that. Secondly, they had alienated the Native Americans, and Smith had gone home. And then lastly, the Native Americans sort of penned them in. They had this fort structure going on there. And, you would think, well, you can get out and go hunting. You can hunt for some food because even deer and rabbits and whatnot, they're out and about in the wintertime. But every time the colonists would go outside the fort, the Native Americans would kind of pick them off. And so they were stuck inside the fort, literally starving to death during that winter. And it's known as the starving time. Now, another guy came along and literally saved the day, and his name was John also. His name is John Rolfe. During this period of time, the Spanish had brought the use of tobacco back to Europe. Before that time, before Columbus and the Columbian Exchange, the Europeans didn't know anything about smoking or using tobacco, and at that time they were smoking mostly pipes because they didn't know anything about cigarettes yet. So they were smoking tobacco in pipes, but it was still addictive, and most of Europe had become addicted to smoking tobacco. But the Spanish had complete control on the tobacco market, and it was actually punishable by death for anyone else to have their hands on a tobacco plant other than a Spanish citizen. But somehow Rolfe got his hands on some tobacco plants and got them smuggled into Jamestown. And everyone started growing tobacco and became wealthy with it. They shipped it back to England, and pretty soon Virginia became a tobacco growing colony. They now decided, oh, I can grow tobacco, it's worth me staying here. I should probably plant some food crops too. I can feed the food crops to some animals, and pretty soon, bingo, the colony is off and growing. Virginia began to expand, and relationship with the Powhatan improved. Rolfe married Pocahontas, which made things even better because now we had a relationship with them, a blood relationship with the Native Americans. And the Virginia Company began giving a head right, a land grant of 50 acres to settlers who paid their own way to get to the colony, meaning we want more people to come, we're drawing more people in. The more people that come here and put land under cultivation, the better. All right, so you have the beginnings of government during this time. Now we're a few years down the road, it's 1619. The Virginia Company, now remember that is the joint stock company, gave the colonists the right to create a sort of self-government, and they called this thing the House of Burgesses. Please remember this, it's important, it will be tested. The House of Burgesses is the very, very first governing body in North America that belonged to England. A burgess is simply another name for a representative. A person who owned land and was an adult male could vote. Okay, but you've got to remember that it's very important. It's the very first representative assembly in North America for the English. Next time, we will study a little bit more about Plymouth and how those people got along